In the last episode of this series, I showed this diagram of the correct positioning for the feet. As far as modern times go, this understanding of the feet was put together by Jeando Masoero. As best as I can tell, in the medical field and in other postural modalities, there is no specific agreed-upon position of the feet that is considered correct. The few that do make a concrete claim about the position of the feet don't tend to be able to explain why they believe what they do. It takes more than intelligence to come to a correct conclusion that virtually no one else has come to, so we should appreciate what Masoero has discovered here. But how did Masoero come to this conclusion about the feet? He applied the general principle that the fascia and muscles of the body should be duly stretched into their full length. That simple principle holds within it a staggering amount of instruction. However, if we look into history, we can see that perhaps this idea concerning the feet is something that people once understood to some extent. Diana Watts was an interesting English woman who was one of the earliest female instructors of jiu-jitsu, the Japanese martial art. She published a book in 1914 called The Renaissance of the Greek Ideal. She was fascinated by the physical training that she believed ancient Greeks engaged in order to attain a higher level of physical performance. In her words, "The secret consists in a condition of the muscles totally different from any realized by athletes since the time of the Greeks, a condition of tension, which transforms dead weight into a living force, and which made the Greek as different from the modern human being as a stretched rubber band differs from a slack one." And on the topic of training that was given to children in ancient Greece, she wrote, "Above all, the child was made to walk on the inside of its foot, with the toes planted in straight line with the heel, never turned outwards." If we examine ancient Greek sculptures, something that Francois Delsarte did in order to help him understand the human form, we can see these sculptures of feet that show the first 3 toes firmly planted, while the outer 2 toes are lifted off the ground. Looking at the structure of the foot, we can see that the first 3 toes are connected to the talus bone, while the outer toes are connected to the calcaneus or heel bone. Masoero would advise us that the strength of the foot and leg are on the first 3 toes, on the inside of the foot. Let's experiment with this and see what we find. Try placing your feet as advised, and then lift your outer 2 toes off the floor to bring the weight onto the inside of the foot. After that, try walking while keeping the outer 2 toes off the floor as you go. But now we must confront the fact that F.M. Alexander's recommendation for the placement of the feet is different from this. He recommended that the feet be angled about 45 degrees to each other. Why did Alexander believe this? We get no clear explanation from his writings. Alexander's books were not guidebooks. They were more about the broad concepts than the specific anatomical minutiae. But it seems likely that he was advising what was commonly considered the active pose in acting. This active pose was to have the feet at 45 degrees, but also to have 1 foot back as a support and 1 foot forward, which Alexander seems to imply is what he's recommending, though he's not entirely clear. So why does Masoero object to this active pose? There are a number of minor reasons, but the major compelling reason is that standing in this way prevents proper abduction of the legs. Abduction, we will recall, is when you move a part of the body away from your center. When you're lacking abduction, you are unduly bringing parts of the body too close to your center. If we accept for the moment that Masoero is correct about the placement of the feet, it's not hard to understand why Alexander's recommendation would prevent proper abduction of the legs. When you point your ankles and feet outwards, you will end up narrowing the distance between your heels. That will also bring the backs of your lower legs closer together, and will wreak havoc on your thighs, especially the back and the inner side of your thighs. By overly widening the front, you will be narrowing the back of the legs, and certain muscles of the legs will become unreliable and weak, while others are overworked. This lack of abduction in the legs is extremely common. It's part of why people end up with legs that are not straight and which are not supporting the torso, but are instead falling forward with it. The only explanation for Alexander's recommendation that I could come up with is that, well, it's quite a difficult task to get someone to rotate their pelvis so that the lower backside comes forward in order to straighten the lower back, while also moving the entire pelvis backwards in space so as to straighten the leg. These movements require the use of muscles that people have trouble accessing because they've left them unused or misused for so long. Cheating the legs a bit can make some of these movements feel a little more comfortable and a little easier to accomplish, at the expense of some shortening of both the legs and the torso. Of course, we don't care what's easy and we don't care what feels comfortable. We just want to lengthen the fascia and muscles into their full length. The correct movements are often the ones that feel the most foreign and difficult to perform, because they will require us to use our muscles in ways that we are not familiar with and have not done in a long time. We don't want to cheat the legs to make it easier, because our goal is not to bring about a certain shape of the back, it's to lengthen the fascia and muscles. Placing the feet as Masoero advises allows for that. Unfortunately, we will likely never know precisely why Alexander thought the way he did. But this serves as a reminder that we should not dogmatically hold to anyone's opinions. We should not assume that this position of the feet is correct simply because Masoero says it is. We should experiment, we should test it, and we should be willing to change our mind if it's reasonable to do so. I will say, in my experience, it's quite clear that this is the correct position of the feet. If you carefully observe the condition of the fascia and muscles in your legs while comparing the two positions, you will see that Masoero's brings about due tension, whereas narrowing the heels and pointing the feet and ankles outwards causes a flabbiness and an overly relaxed state in the lower leg. But don't take my word for it either. Experiment and see what makes sense to you. However, if Alexander is in fact wrong, perhaps we can still find a rather significant glimmer of hope in this story. That even if we are imperfect, even if we have a few details wrong, if we are consciously controlling and guiding ourselves, and we get our torso most of the way there, we can perform gestures that almost no one else can. We've outlined the correct position of the feet, but we need to dig into the specifics a little more. We also need to get some help from the soles of our feet. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What kinds of muscular actions are possible with the muscles on the soles of your feet? Do you ever consciously guide those muscles? In what kind of situation would you consider the soles of your feet? What about when you're lifting something, or trying to hold a somewhat heavy object in your hand? Do you think about the soles of your feet in that situation at all? Give it some thought, and then join me next episode, and we will get to the bottom of the feet.